It's popular to be labeled a centrist, to lament the misunderstood nature of your position as the reasonable sort in the middle, just trying to get the two sides to embrace your reasonableism as well. But centrism has problems, and some of them are pretty significant. At the same time, we are going to try to be careful to separate the problems that centrism has from the problems that centrists often have, because while there is overlap, they are not all one and the same. I realize that this video is going to be controversial, it may be popular for all the wrong reasons, etc., but this is my considered opinion, honestly given in good faith. This is not to say that centrism, or rather that certain forms of centrism are completely bunk or worthless, but rather that centrism has just as many issues as any other polarizing belief system, and that centrists should be honest and aware of these issues. I hope this prompts self-reflection rather than a flame war, because I'd rather promote introspection instead of rage. Here's a few positions or examples that I've seen used for centrism in the online political world. First, centrists by undecided default. Someone once described their friend to me, saying that he had declared himself a political centrist on some issues, meaning that he had not taken or endorsed a side until he had more knowledge of the issue and could take an informed stance. This is probably the most practical, reasonable, and useful attempt at centrism, trying to avoid bias until one has researched enough data to take a position. This is our first category of centrist, someone who has used it as a placeholder for an issue until they make up their mind. It's a temporary state, not an end goal. But the second category of centrists are those who tend to see wisdom in the middle as a desirable end in and of itself. Next, we have centrists by middle truth. These people try to walk a tightrope by being in the middle on every issue as a matter of balancing between the viewpoints of the left and right and trying to be more reasonable. They're 50-50 on everything. You can already see one flaw in this logic. There are many issues where there is no reasonable middle ground. This, of course, brings up the argumentum ad temperantium fallacy, or the golden mean fallacy, which suggests that the truth is always somewhere in the middle between two polarized positions. Ockrent's law also addresses this by saying that the pursuit of balance can create imbalance, because sometimes something is true. One thing being true is a fairly imbalanced position, because it means that the other opposing positions are likely to be false. And just because you picked the "how about no Holocaust" position doesn't mean that you are balanced or in the middle. And maybe that's a good thing. Of course, there is centrism by generalization. I've seen some evidence of centrists on Twitter ham-fistedly arguing that centrism is the main spectrum, and that it's the polar extremists that are the core of the left and right movements. It's a bit of centrism by redefinition, by saying, actually, most people are centrists. This is an expansionist view of centrism, and it doesn't seem to be too common, but I have seen it used. I might add here that being someone who isn't a pure tribalist isn't centrism either, and it's not logical to smash people like this into the centrist camp for the sake of numbers. Next is centrism by averaged values. This is probably the biggest group. They see this as being like that elusive centrist score on the internet political quiz, or maybe more accurately, a person whose views on all issues average out to the median. This is not that they are 50-50 on every issue, but rather that they are to the left on some, right on others, but the numbers pretty much average out in the middle. For example, plus 90 to the political right on gun rights and minus 90 to the political left on healthcare essentially yields a net value of 0, or the middle. This is probably the best description of this position, but this position has issues itself. There are two ways to look at all this. First, if centrism has some desirable trait, which apparently it does, then a person is apt to use confirmation bias if they take an online quiz or if they self-average their own views. In that case, what they're really doing is making up their own metric, then scoring it, weighting it, and averaging a centrist score because it's desirable. In other words, they look over their life and their beliefs and go, yeah, I'm pretty much a centrist across all the issues. They are self-diagnosed as centrists, which is as useful as the idea that we all self-diagnose ourselves as reasonable. It's also of note that liberals and conservatives do this too. The second way to look at all this is to set aside the desirability bias and subjective self-labeling and to look at the test itself, the scale, the metric for objectively figuring out what a centrist or centrism even is. Centrism, middleism, symmetry, whatever you want to call it, demands an objective and referenceable scale, by which to objectively place yourself between the others. There's just a few problems with that. For better or worse, American politics is often conceptually portrayed as a single-axis scale. That's a fancy way of saying a line with a left end and a right end. Now, there are more nuanced ways of looking at political stances, such as the 8 values quiz and so on, but largely the left-right scale is how we generalize it. We're going to stick with that, although the issues I'm going to describe are present for multi-dimensional scales and graphs as well. So here's our line, our political scale. Now look at this and pick the middle spot. Why did you pick that spot? Simply put, because of your judgment that it is in fact equidistant from the ends. The center point of a line, or more correctly, a line segment, is never its own objective standard. It is always placed in relation to 2 other points, the left end and right end of the line segment. In the same way, one of the problems with centrism is that it is not an original thought or a self-defining stance. It is always a derivative of the definition of what the ends are and what the center is not. It's about being not left or not right. It's a reactive stance, a position that is almost entirely defined by somebody else. There is no center point without equidistant relation to the ends. The center is defined by the outer. It cannot define itself. It is only a derivative thought process. But let's return to this line segment, this scale we call American politics. We conceptualize it as an x-axis scale, but this scale is somewhat flawed in our conception of it. If you look up the definition of a scale or a spectrum, you will see consistent ideas such as intervals, known distances and lengths, and fixed reference points upon a line segment that are objectively codified, defined, and agreed upon scientifically. This is true whether you are talking about a tape measure, or frequencies of light, or sound, or anything. The problem is that the American political scale is not a line segment at all. It's a line. There are no fixed ends. There are no interval marks, and there is no agreed upon definition of this scale and no authority saying it only goes from Richard Spencer to Antifa, or this is the 25% conservative mark. The political quizzes we all take are written by humans with bias, but also written by humans who are not the authority on all political positions or the spectrum. The results may place you in a field like this, when in reality, the field may look more like this. Political tests are highly subjective, and as such, I wouldn't die on the battlefield of defending your score. Dave Cullen and others have described the scale as an airplane and being on the center left or center right, but this assumes there's symmetry in the scale, and this is not the case either. The political left and the political right are not mirror images of each other by any reasonable metric, and I might explore this idea in a future video. Let me know in the comments if that sounds like an interesting idea. The true ends of the spectrum are, at best, defined by the people who have gone furthest to the right or the left, but only at the moment. Groups can die off, come into existence, or shift positions, and that can change the scale. For example, the Occupy movement doesn't exist on the furthest left end anymore. Antifa does. This means that who and what defines the scale today are not the groups and issues who defined it in the past, nor are they the same groups that will define it further into the future. It's not just about who defines the spectrum, and thereby the center. It's also about when it was defined, and when that definition happened to include you. The objectivity and range of this scale are absolutely in question, but that's not nearly as great an issue as one other very key fact. This scale is in motion. It's not a question of if the scale can move, it's a question of how much it already has and how fast it has at that. If you averaged out your values from issue to issue to find your centrist score, then that doesn't really work because some of those values never change, like abortion, and others never stay the same, like racism or gender oppression. I mentioned this in one of my very first videos, but the scale of politics and culture is constantly in motion, and it moves almost exclusively to the left, and as we shall see, the rate of change isn't consistent either. My go-to example of political scale flux is homosexuality. Note how progressive ideology lauded Elton John for coming out as bisexual in the 70s and gay in the 80s, and the same for Freddie Mercury's sexual orientation in the 70s and 80s. Being gay was a progressive ideal, and these men will forever be worshipped as progressive icons for that reason. Note that this same protection is not afforded Milo Yiannopoulos nor Dave Rubin, who are now just upper-class, married, white males. We all know how progressives feel about those. Or consider how many agreed-upon genders there were when C.H. Summers or Camille Paglia were in their heyday as progressive firebrands. How many such genders were there according to progressives in 2003, just 15 years ago? But how many are there now? But perhaps the best illustration of this is a series of graphs from the Pew organization depicting American political stances. In this animation, notice the shift to the left by the left. Here, let me play that again. There's a few things of note. Notice what happens in 2004 when the political right becomes more liberal, quite possibly a reaction to the waning popularity of the Iraq War. But note how the political right seems to realign itself with more conservative ideas in voting by 2011, which is probably a response to the progressivism that Barack Obama brought to office. Finally, notice the huge cutoff tail on the left in 2017. This data goes further than the scale can depict. One can extrapolate this to suggest that if there were a more progressive option, a significant number of those surveyed would take it. This tail is even more pronounced when you shift the data from general public to only the politically engaged. So you can see the political shift that has occurred. How does this relate to centrism by an objective metric? Well, let's look at this graph from 1994. Where's the median and the mean? How about in 2017? The median and mean are as close to objective centrism as you can get, right? But these values have objectively changed. Well, centrism is actually here at the mixed point, one might say. Disregarding the fact that the data and scale now go beyond Pew's line here, the scale is in reality now longer to the left, and mixed isn't in the middle anymore. The other issue with this is the fact that the questions themselves are highly likely to have changed meaning, even if the wording has not changed. Thus, the position of always voting liberal or conservative likely has changed meaning since 1994. So what does all this mean for centrism? It means that the scale shifts left, and so does the center. If we could prove you a perfect centrist by a perfect standard, in 2 years they'd call you center-right. In 5 years, you'll be a conservative, and in 8 years, you'll be a Nazi. It might not even take that long. If you want to stay a centrist for long in this climate, you're not only going to have to change your beliefs, but you're also going to have to shift to the left to follow the shift of the scale itself. Fortunately, I don't think a lot of people are going to change their beliefs just to stay centrist in name only. So here's the crux of the matter regarding the philosophy of centrism. If you can't reliably, consistently, or accurately define a scale's range, its increments, or a fixed or objective point that it holds to, and if that scale is moving and perhaps even stretching or compressing at times, then you most certainly cannot accurately define what its center is and whether or not you are really in the center beyond the most momentary of definitions. Those are the conceptual problems with centrism. The problems that centrists themselves tend to have are a little different. Perhaps the most obvious problem that centrists exhibit is the pride or even arrogance in their position. They are proud in their location on the political spectrum, as if they have a corner on truth from the middle pole, and as if they are exempt from this same problem that plagues both left and right tribalism. It's become a group of the ungrouped, a pole for those rejecting polarity. Centrism is the new tribalism of anti-tribalism, and one central aspect of tribalism is pride in your tribe. Avoiding tribalism is fine, but that's not what centrism practically is. It's not that centrists are any different from anyone else, rather it's that they're more or less the same. At times, and in some cases, it seems as if centrists only use centrism as an excuse to be overly contrarian, obnoxiously complaining about the solutions that someone else presents, but without presenting any solutions of their own. In spite of this, it does seem like at least some centrists are trying to remain neutral and not pick a side despite the shifting scale, and perhaps doing so even in denial of some of their own leanings, alignments, and allies. The attempt to remain sideless is ill-fated at best. The harsh truth is that the culture war is not going to let you walk the line, at least not for very long. Often it seems that centrists don't like the idea of picking a side because it means getting shot at with everyone else who happens to be on that side. I've got news for you. Someone else will pick your side and target you anyway, especially if you stick with your principles. Just because the rest of us are on a side doesn't mean we embrace the ugly tribalism that centrists claim to fear. For me, it's about a pursuit of intellectual honesty. Intellectual honesty means that I have the freedom to not be a tribalist and to criticize my own side when they deserve it. I am a conservatarian. I am on the political right, and I do have some very significant and deep-seated points of contention, not just with the GOP as a party, but with conservatism and libertarianism as movements. That doesn't make me a centrist, though. I would suggest a cessation of chasing the golden middle or the perfect average, and cease being proud or arrogant over such a pursuit. Someone else's metric of your centrism might be off, your own standard might be worse, and the culture war might let you hold neither standard for very long, and if the culture war leaves you alone by some miracle, then the scale itself is merely sliding beneath your very feet. This is not a good position to be a tribalist over, any more than any other position is. Defend ideas on the issues, let the chips fall where they may, and don't worry too much about the coveted centrist label. If you're going to get attacked, it's best if you find a fixed position and hold it, not for your tribe, but for yourself and for your own ideas. And don't freak out if holding such a position places you next to someone like me or others on the political right. As the lines of the culture war change, odds are we aren't your enemy.